live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek.
In this video, we're going to talk about the episode, The Conscience of the King. And I'm joined for this video by my very good friend, Colin Cox. I'm going to let him introduce himself, and then he's going to give you a brief plot summary, and then we're going to launch into the social justice elements of this episode.
Yeah, Phil, again, thank you for inviting me onto your channel. My name is Colin Cox. Yeah, no, this is, the second time, maybe?
Yes.
Phil's been super generous inviting me on. I'm an educator at Northeast State Community College in Blountville, Tennessee, and I host a couple of podcasts. One is called the Hop-Ons Podcast. The other one is called the Cluttered Desk Podcast. And Phil and I are friends from Vermont. He and I did some graduate work together at the University of Vermont. I know this is something that I hope we can talk about. I am not that familiar with Star Trek, but I really enjoyed this episode, and I am excited to talk about it. Particularly, I want to talk to you about whether or not this is William Shatner doing good work or bad work, because I thought he was pretty good in this. I know he has like a reputation of maybe being a bit of a hammy actor, but so this is The Conscience of the King, and this is a quick summary. In this episode, Captain Kirk, at the behest of an old friend, comes to Planet Q to investigate the discovery of a new synthetic food. However, this is a trick. His old friend, Dr. Thomas Layton, suspects the leader of a Shakespearean acting troupe is in fact Kodos the Executioner, the former governor of an Earth colony on Tarsus IV. Years earlier, he committed, that is to say, Kodos, this person that he suspects is Kodos, he committed mass genocide, killing thousands of people. And from there, it's much like Hamlet. Shatner or Kirk is thrust into this kind of investigation to discover whether or not the leader of this acting troupe, this reclusive leader of this acting troupe, is in fact Kodos the Executioner or not. And he interacts with his daughter a lot as well. So how did I do? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think that's pretty good. I want to add a couple of points. So one important element is apparently, even though Kodos was first off, I think the name Kodos the Executioner is an amazing sci-fi name. So medal to the author for that. But apparently, even though Kodos was the governor of a colony of 8,000 people, 4,000 of whom he killed, we'll talk more about that. But he was a governor of a colony of 8,000 people. Presumably, he had been around and doing stuff in other places before becoming the governor of Tarsus IV. Despite that, only 9 people could actually identify Kodos, the executioner, by sight. 7 of those people, well, so 6 of those people are dead at the beginning of the episode. Tom Clayton gets murdered, so that's leaves only 2. Kevin Riley, who actually we've talked about in previous episodes. I've talked about in previous episodes.
Okay.
And Captain Kirk.
Both on the the ship.
Yes.
Conveniently enough. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, that pattern of deaths of all of the people who could identify Kodos, that's part of the way that Spock figures out logically that Anton Caridian, this actor, must be Kodos, because the Caridian company was always in the area. So I think that's an important component of it in terms of that certainty and the stakes of murder. Because the other, I mean, you said this is a kind of Hamlet thing. The other big Shakespearean intertext here is, of course, Macbeth.
Right.
Because the first play that we see the Caridian company performing is Macbeth, with Anton Caridian / Kodos in the title role. And somewhat creepily, his daughter as Lady Macbeth.
I mean, you could also, like, I would even want to go as far as to say, like, maybe Lear with the old father-daughter, and perhaps even the Tempest, like, because, and this is something that I think scholars talk about a lot, the relationships between daughters and fathers, in particular, like old fathers. That dynamic's at play in this play as well, or in this episode as well, and even with something like Hamlet, the relationship between Polonius and his daughter Ophelia, I think you can see maybe some connections here. I think Kodos is a little more, maybe a little less of a satirical figure than Polonius is.
No, there's definitely echoes of other
echoes.
Well.
Echoes. Yeah.
So I think the first thing I want us to grapple with here, since we've started talking about the role of Shakespeare plays here, is the role of art in terms of particularly like how we see ourselves in the world, or how we make sense of the world.
It's I'm sorry for jumping in. I mean, it's interesting because at one point I think Caridian talks about, I don't know if he because he's like, his name sounds so similar, so sometimes I get them confused, but he talks about how maybe he says like Kodos was a part he played, and that's really like, there's a lot of this way, and because we, at least I'm operating under the assumption that we haven't seen this character in the previous, let us say, 12 episodes, we are uncertain if this is someone who, if this is a kind of like psychological de-evolution, the way he's talking about his identity, or if this is just who he is. But he makes this point, I think, near the end of the episode about how he's always thought of himself as just playing different parts, like all of his identities are just parts he's played. So even though he's only been the leader of this acting troupe for a number of years, it seems he wants to at least communicate the possibility that he's always saw himself as someone performing. I guess. And so that has, I mean, I would argue that has a kind of cascading effect on how we should think about this character and how they existed as Kodos the Executioner. Because I think that's a way, and you can tell me what you think about this, that's a way he's almost creating an excuse for himself. Like, it wasn't me who made that decision, it was the character Kodos who made that decision. Yeah.
That's especially interesting because one of the tests that Kirk does, because I mean, you'd said Kirk becomes a kind of Hamlet figure where he does these sort of tests or these sort of gimmicky little things to. Well,
there's a delay, like Kirk's constantly delaying, like Hamlet does. So.
Yeah, but one of the tests that Kirk uses to try and determine if this is Kodos is a voice match, right? and he comes to Caridian's room on the ship, and he has him read out the execution order that Kodos had publicly announced on Tarsus 4. And it's really it's a really fascinating moment if we're thinking about Caridian as the eternal actor, because Caridian he looks at the page for the first part of it, but then he reads the second half without actually looking at it, and he reads it as an actor. Like he reads it.
He does.
He acts it.
There's some histrionics there, like
yes.
It's not just and like the way just that voices work in this episode, I also think is incredibly fascinating. But it's interesting, Phil, because he even has a convenient excuse, which is, I am an experienced actor, so I'm just good at memorizing. I just learned, you're like, Jesus, man, like this guy is he's slippery in the worst kinds of ways. But I guess if you perpetually frame yourself as an actor, it gives you these convenient outs, which he certainly uses.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's actually another major issue to discuss, is this question of like guilt, redemption, responsibility, and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I want to clarify a little bit what Kodos's justification is for the executions. There was a famine in the colony. Food supplies were running low. They did not think that food supplies were going to get there in time to save people, and so Kodos, according to Spock, by his own arbitrary standards, his own arbitrary eugenics standards, determined which half of the colonists were going to live and which were going to die, in order that food could be rationed among the remaining population, in the hopes that some people in the colony would survive rather than the entire colony starve.
And I had some questions that maybe you could, so correct me if I'm wrong. Kodos never explains the particulars of his eugenics rationale. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Second,
we get that only from Spock. The idea that there's some logic to choosing who lived and who died.
That's correct. Yeah. So because I was really struck by this language, an Earth colony. Now, are we to assume there were any indigenous people that were a part of this? Because, like, what I was thinking was, like, the episode doesn't explicitly say it, but is it possible that what Spock's dancing around is the idea that Kodos executed any indigenous people who had integrated into this Earth colony? Because that word colony, like I understand what it means in a kind of like space science fiction context, but I don't know. When I see a bunch of white people talking about colonies, I think like there's some indigenous folk who have been murdered, and so like that's I couldn't get that out of my head, that like Kodos basically just murdered a bunch of indigenous people. Because I guess like the other question I had is, why do you need to kill half? Like that doesn't. You know?
So in terms of killing half of the population, we really don't like. I would actually, I don't know, this is maybe a perverse thing on my part, but I would actually really love to have more details about this set of executions and what
I would too. Yeah.
How the decisions were made. We never get it. There's never any discussion of Kodos again in the entire of all of the Star Trek that I've seen.
Really? Okay.
Maybe there is in some of the more recent movies that I haven't been keeping up with as much.
Yeah.
There's no textual evidence necessarily that there was an indigenous population. So again, I think this maybe is something that as somebody who is not a big Star Trek fan, this is maybe worth making perfectly clear about. The the early portion, especially of season 1, stuff changes all the time in terms
Does
of
it really?
how things are. Like, they refer to all different kinds of central authorities, especially the first half of the first season. They periodically refer to themselves as an Earth ship, but then later it becomes very specifically a Federation ship, and the Federation includes a wide variety of planets, a wide variety of human colonies, a wide variety of non-human species. So when they say an Earth colony, they probably do just mean a group of humans who have left Earth and settled an uninhabited planet, possibly terraformed.
Yeah.
We come to terraformed planets later, and we do come to uninhabited planets later. It's quite possible that this involved the destruction of an indigenous population.
I don't know how it's not, there's
not enough info with this episode.
There's not, but I guess like even a recent piece of, let us say, science fiction intellectual property, this shows Stranger Things. There's a whole 4th season about this character colonizing what seems to be this uninhabited space, but then it becomes quite clear. It's like, no, they were like humanoid figures. Maybe they weren't human in the way we would conventionally define it, but the point is, like, this white dude totally colonized this space, even though he's not using that language. I guess I always have difficulty thinking there isn't some indigenous life form that was colonized, and boy, my apologies for using the passive voice there, because it really eradicates like that we colonized, right? Yes. And I guess, like, I'm asking those questions simply because I think if we want to have a question, or if we want to have a conversation about the ethics of it, and if we want to reckon with the ambiguity, and listen, like, there's a lot of great like television and media scholarship about how like TV is this really fluid medium. It still is a really fluid medium, and trying to reckon with continuity can be super tricky sometimes, because things are always changing and retcons are always happening and so on and so forth. But I just, like, how did he decide? We don't receive clarity about it. And I cannot help but think that the subtext of that is it's probably an indigenous non-white cohort that he decided to eradicate. But that's I have no evidence of that aside from just like generations of like colonist behavior, So,
I mean, we do in other episodes get instances of colonization and the Federation, for as much as they're officially committed to diplomacy and respecting the life patterns of other worlds, they very often don't live up to that ideal. So it's not an unreasonable supposition necessarily. In the case specifically of Tarsus 4, we just don't have enough information to know what kinds of people were in this colony, whether there was an indigenous population.
Again,
so I'd love to know more, but we don't.
But so like even with that ambiguity acknowledged, what do you, as an experienced viewer of this property, what do you think about Kodos and his what I think he would characterize as a rational, necessary decision? A really utilitarian decision, I guess.
That's exactly the word that I think describes his view of it. I have a lot of trouble with Kodos as a character and sort of navigating the ethics of it, because I can see that utilitarian aspect. Like, there is a coldly logical argument that it's better to painlessly kill 4,000 people so that 4,000 other people can live than to have 8,000 people painfully starve to death. I can see the logic of that.
Sure, yeah.
And the other aspect that occurs to me is, or the other comparison that occurs to me with that is the Great Leap Forward in communist China. Because the idea, right, was we're going to collectivize agriculture, we're going to collectivize production, essentially, and millions of people starved to death. It was a disaster as a policy, but at the same time, the Great Leap Forward helped set the stage for modern China, which is one of the most productive societies in the history of the world. Still an incredibly problematic society in many ways, but who isn't?
Yeah.
Other than
they
Denmark,
do,
I guess. But
yeah, I mean, as much as we, especially here in the United States, you and I excluded, perhaps, like to characterize them as communists. It's like, no, they just really do capitalism better than anyone in the world at this point.
I see those.
Sorry. Yeah.
So I see those sort of two utilitarian elements that, like, Kodos's direct explanation, I understand, and the Great Leap Forward comparison, the idea that, like, suffering can catapult growth. And actually, the Industrial Revolution is another much slower comparison. Like, the Industrial Revolution, for the vast majority of the population, was horrendous. And it took a couple of centuries. China just sort of did it in about 10 years.
I mean, there's a lot of powerful late 19th century American literature about what it was like for, let us just say, for a lack of a better phrase, non-aristocratic folk to be the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It's awful. Like, I'll tell you quickly what I think about this, and then you can tell me what you think. I understand everything you're saying, and I'm certainly not a scholar of China's economic history or its production history. But anytime someone makes this eugenics turn, I can't help but think this is just a lack of imagination. This is not just privilege, but this is racism, different forms of bigotry, masquerading as cold rationality, right? And I think it's just like those moves betray really a lack of imagination. Like, again, if we're thinking about a recent intellectual property that uses these sorts of ideas, like those Avengers movies with that big purple Thanos figure, like he's making the same arguments. And, I've had conversations with students before, and they basically say, some of them will just explicitly say, well, Thanos was maybe right. And then, of course, and I know Kodos didn't have this, but then I respond with, but he had like a magic glove that could do anything. It's like his response is to kill half of everything. It's like, that's a lack of imagination and bigotry masquerading as cold rationality. And so I don't know what you think about that, because I always like to think, is there another path that we're simply not taking? And I think part of the problem with this episode is because we don't have the particulars of what happened on Tarsus 4, we don't know if there was another path. We just have what Kodos says, which is there wasn't a path. And I don't know if the narrativizing from figures like Kodos is something we should trust.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually the other side of it for me. That's a big part of the reason I find it so difficult to figure out my ethical judgment of Kodos. I mean, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm not it was fine for him to kill 4,000 people.
Sure. No, I know that's not what you're saying.
I want that to be absolutely clear.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right, though, because if we go back to the Great Leap Forward comparison, yes, Mao debatably at least set the stage for China's massive modernization, massive increase in production.
Sure.
Stalin arguably did the same thing in the Soviet Union with the 5-year plans, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question of whether that was the only way to have done it. And I think that's
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Could China have modernized without famine that killed millions?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. I don't know. I wasn't there. Obviously the people who were there were constrained by Mao's take on Marxism, Leninism, etc.
Sure.
But yeah, it probably could have been done a different way. And so that's always, I think you're absolutely right there. There's that limit of the utilitarian perspective, particularly when it becomes a question of achieving an end through whatever means necessary.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of those like early 20th century examples in quasi-communist countries are really quite good, because when I think about someone like Lenin, for example, in Russia, this is again not a scholar of early 20th century Russia, Lenin, etc. I've read him before, but I've also read Marx, and I know that borrowing from Hegel, Marx's point is that capitalism will reach a point of internal contradiction, that it will produce this next stage through its contradiction. And listen, we could talk about that misreading of Hegel, but that was not Russia in the early 20th century.
Yes.
Scholars are really clear about this, that what Lenin saw was not consistent with Russia as a country at a particular stage of economic mechanized development. He just tried to insert a square Marxist piece into a round peg, and it didn't fit, and people suffered, so that's something else that I think is worth acknowledging, that is it possible that Kodos just fundamentally misread this situation, and because he had so much power, no one could really stop him. And when I think about examples like Mao, when I think about figures like Lenin, that's what I think about too. Were there any mechanisms in place to stop? Were the people who the 4,000 people who died? Did they have any representation in this decision? Because here's the thing, I think they would have said, we're not okay with this dying thing. This dying plan of yours is not cool with us. So that's why I'm always just deeply skeptical, even with an absence of evidence or additional information. I'm just deeply skeptical of these kinds of stories that the Kodoses of the world or the galaxy tell.
So we do find out that Kodos had declared martial law and taken control.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, Kodos as a single individual would not have been able to kill 4,000 people. So clearly,
that's really good. Yeah.
Clearly, there were enough people in this colony who were happy to go along with this mass execution. That he was able to carry it out.
Yeah, unless there's this, and this is a science fiction story, unless there's just this weapon he could have used that really I guess a nuke, where he's just pressing a button and then boom, 4,000 people are gone. But I think the point you're making though is it's logical to assume, as Spock might suggest, there were collaborators and co-conspirators. Where are they? I mean, I don't know. Maybe they're playing Claudius in his Hamlet. Who knows, right? But where's everyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then So I want to take it back a little bit more to
Please.
kind of got off China and Russia and whether or not it's okay to commit genocide tangent. The answer is no, by the way. It is not.
The answer is
genocide. Yeah. I want to reiterate that because I did say some things that could be taken as justifications.
As a two-time guest on this YouTube channel, I feel like you've deputized me to say the position of this channel is genocide is bad. We do not endorse it. So yeah.
Yes. That is a hot take on behalf of this channel. So I want to come back to this and actually bring it back a little bit to the Shakespeare elements as well.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that really struck me as I was rewatching the episode for this interview is Kodos just sort of leaves Tarsus 4 and becomes Anton Karidian, the actor, and seems to think that makes it okay. Like there's no, and this is maybe where something like Macbeth is a bit more of a bit closer of an intertext. There's no element of redemption, right? There's nothing that, like, Kodos never, he doesn't try and become a great humanitarian or something like this. He becomes an actor putting on classical plays. Yeah. And that, I mean, I think you and I would both say that is in some sense a benefit to humanity or to the galaxy.
I mean, especially
how much does that weigh against killing 4,000 innocent people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not prepared to make that kind of calculation, but I think what I can say is if Ben Jonson famously changed. I don't know if he changed it because I don't think he adapted Lear, but his commentary on Lear was simply, it's like you can't actually have the play end with Cordelia dying. Like that's just like, we can't do that,
it's bad tragedy.
It's bad tragedy. Yeah. It's unnecessarily bad. And there are certainly versions of The Merchant of Venice that cut certain parts of the end to accentuate certain points. So I mention all of this because, we don't see a full Kodos Carillion performance of any of these plays. However, the episode does begin with Macbeth. And if we want to assume that he remains, this is a fraught word, faithful to the text, you could almost imagine that perpetually performing that play is maybe a kind of penance, I want to as often as I can show people the consequences of making these kinds of awful decisions, and even we see him, he's the former King Hamlet at the end of the episode.
The ghost.
The ghost, he's the ghost in that production of Hamlet, which, I don't know how true this is, but people seem to think that Shakespeare may have been the ghost in Elizabethan productions of Hamlet. I think that's just a fanciful story. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But even the function he plays, like, assuming that's a deliberate choice, speaking or like having this kind of haunting presence or wanting to, because deciding to be the ghost, the dead king, means that you are putting yourself in a position to communicate a particular message, and so, I don't know what you think about that, but I mean, that's maybe one way to read it, assuming he doesn't make changes to Macbeth, that's maybe.
I think it's worth getting even a little more specific than that. If we look at the actual lines, because we really only see a very small number of the lines performed. If we think about what we see in the performance of Macbeth, we have Lady Macbeth's Is it done? Is he dead? I'm going to get these lines slightly wrong.
Yeah, I can't remember them either.
And,
so yeah.
And then we get Macbeth's, all Neptune's oceans could not wash the blood from these hands.
Yeah.
So
that's good, yeah.
The bit of Macbeth we get. And then the bit of the ghosts lines that we get is, you probably know the speech better than I do since you're a big Hamlet guy. It's the, I am your father's spirit doomed for a certain term to walk the earth.
Yeah.
That I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison cell, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So the Macbeth portion is, I have committed murder that will stain me forever. And the portion of Hamlet is, a ghost of who I was, live in eternal torment, and I get only a brief reprieve from my suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great.
Kodos.
That's great.
That's his life now.
Yeah, even if you think about Macbeth, like that part. So this is immediately after he murders or assassinates Duncan.
Yes.
This is not the Macbeth of Acts 4 and 5 who has and this is, my apologies, a technical academic term, like gone banana crazy pants. This is the Macbeth who is, as you said, really reckoning with what he's done. Yep. And as you said, like wearing on his hands, not just the decision he made, but I would even argue he's wearing everything that preceded that decision, like all of that preemptive guilt that we see in the play. That's I think if there's any way, and hey, again, not redeeming a figure who has committed mass genocide, but if the point is, can we understand this character's relationship to what he did? The bits of Shakespeare, and this is, I think, an interesting moment where the text mediates for us what Kodos thinks. I think you're absolutely right. Like, this is a deeply, deeply regretful. Like, this is a character who just categorically regrets what he did, even if he tries to like justify it later. Save 4,000, kill 4,000, so on and so forth. I think you're totally right.
And that connects us back also to that idea that you had talked about earlier of Kodos as a role that he plays. I mean, that's the thing, is if it can be Macbeth, the ghost, Kodos, and they're all on equal footing as these sort of imaginary characters, then that becomes a way, psychologically at least, for him to distance himself from the experience of what he's done.
I mean, that's true, but like, hearing you say that, tell me what you think about this. Like, he's almost elevating himself and his life and like the tragedy of Kodos. Like it's like much like Hamlet and Macbeth are these canonical texts that people perform. It's like, will the tragedy of Kodos be a canonical text that people perform? I think that's the part that might give me pause hearing you talk about this. Is like he's actively doing the work of self-fashioning his legacy, and like, that's, oh boy, like, I don't know if I like that. So
no, I think that's very fair to make that. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but that's definitely a hugely problematic element of this. Because as you say, like, if Kodos is a role equal to these great canonical roles, then, like, because sure, like, we could say Macbeth is wrong to kill Duncan. He's wrong to kill Banquo. He's wrong to do all these various things. But it's also a play.
It is.
We know that the next night when the company performs it again, Macbeth can kill Duncan again, can kill Banquo again, can kill everybody again, and they're going to keep getting up. And this, of course, is the point made by Guildenstern in Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Actors die 1,000 deaths without actually ever experiencing death.
Yeah.
The 4,000 people that Kodos killed don't get that luxury. They get back up and perform that role again.
But it like the kind of self-fashioning, if we follow this reading where Kodos almost wants to elevate his life to a kind of canonical status, what an interesting way of absolving himself, because they weren't really people who died. They were just bit parts in this larger tragedy that is Kodos' life, and like now we're getting into, I mean, again, I don't know what the international footstamp is for your YouTube channel, but at least here in the United States, like this great men of history theory is a way of crafting the different like parts and pieces of U.S. history. Like Kodos is really inserting himself into that kind of like ideological tradition, I guess, and I think that's part of what's troubling as well, because even and I know that like you and I have affection for these like great English actors who have in many ways defined what it means to be Hamlet or Macbeth or Lear in the 20th and 21st century. Your Ian McKellens and your Patrick Stewarts and your Judi Dench's and so on, your Maggie Smiths and so on and so forth. Like when you hear them talk
David
about
Tennant.
these, your boy, I mean, Tennant's Hamlet, like you and I, like we, that's a really good Hamlet, you know. Like I just, when I hear them talk about it, I think understandably so, you know, there's a lot of affection for these figures. A lot of sympathy for, like, when I hear Ian McKellen talk about playing Macbeth, one of the points he seems to emphasize, and this is just a summary, is you almost need to have sympathy for someone like this, because how can I actively and with fidelity communicate all the nuances of a performance if I don't have the kind of sympathy for him that he has for himself? And so then I'm thinking, holy shit, like Kodos is like putting like generations of actors in a position to feel sympathy for him, you know. Like that's maniacal, you know. So
so there's one, we are going a bit long here, and I don't
sorry
much more of your time, but there is one thing I do want that hasn't come up in our summary or in our conversation so far. Anton Caridian is not actually murdering any of the witnesses who could identify Kodos.
That's true.
Actually, a really, really important point. His daughter, who Kirk is kirking with. Kirk is attempting to seduce her, and she seems to be attempting to seduce him. She has murdered all of these people. She attempts to murder Kevin Riley. She poisons his space milk.
Is that what that is? Like, I didn't know if it was milk or coffee or like a spirit. I had no idea.
I don't know if it's meant to be milk within the universe of Star Trek, but it looks like milk as a prop.
I like describing it as space milk, because that's really what it looks like. It's just space milk. So
he's got colored cubes and a glass of milk.
I was like, what are these cubes? It's like, what an interesting, like, utilitarian dinner. It's like, do I want a red cube for dinner tonight or a blue cube?
Well, so this is a bit less social justice-y, but it's a kind of interesting thing. The food on Star Trek is also somewhat inconsistent, because we do have these. First, like, there's a lot of sci-fi where it's just like protein cubes. That's
protein cubes.
We get that in Firefly. We get that in Farscape. That seems to be what Kevin Riley is eating here. But then there's other episodes where, like, they go to the galley and, like, Kirk is having a chicken sandwich.
Well, I mean, they even have like martinis at that party or something, right? Yeah. So it's fascinating sometimes how that works. Yeah.
So, but anyway, the food is not the
focus. But anyway.
So this woman, the daughter, I can't remember her first name.
I can't either.
Little Caridian.
Yeah.
She attempts to murder Kevin Riley by putting Windex in his space milk, which he then drinks and almost dies, but not quite. She attempts to murder Kirk by putting a phaser on overload in his quarters. Not really sure how she got into his quarters. Seems like he should lock his door, but whatever. That's minor point.
I mean, that might be evidence that the two of them had sex.
It could be.
Yeah.
But I want us to talk about this a little bit, because at the end, actually, Kevin Riley comes backstage of the performance that the Caridian Company is doing for the crew, and he's going to kill Anton Caridian, at which point it basically comes out that the daughter has been killing all of these people to try and protect her father from ever being recognized as Kodos. And he's devastated by this. And it's like, I never wanted what I had done to
That's what he says.
You.
Yeah.
But she did this all on her own. So what do we make of that?
Well, I just quickly, one thing, what's the name of the officer?
Kevin Riley.
Yeah, like he feels very much like a Laertes figure, in the second half of Hamlet. Like he's like, all action, I'm gonna go, and so on and so forth.
I have decided it's true, and I'm going to act on it.
Yeah. I shall act. I don't know, man, because like I know in the email you and I, or in the emails that we shared, you wanted to talk about like familial relations and let us say the commitments we have to family, I guess. And what's interesting is, so her age, like, I am not sure, because it's been 20 years, is that right? Yes. Since the massacre or the genocide.
It's been 20 years since the execution. She's 19.
Okay. Well, see, that's what so like, was she, and that was really my question. So like it's fascinating how you could almost read her, if we just wanted to use like some really like fraught symbolism as like this symbol of what Kodos maybe hopes the next stage of his life is,
Absolutely.
Like really like channeling all of that into the figure of the child. And I know you and I have read a fair amount of like queer theory that really tries to theorize, like, what does the child mean and represent symbolically. But I think this episode really wants to at least suggest that there is no way of like cleanly and clearly demarcating, at least for the parent, what you were and what you are. You know? And I guess in that way, like, it feels very biblical, I guess, like the child will inherit the sins of the father, and so on and so forth. And it gets to the point where like she devolves into a kind of madness at the end of this episode, which, like, I think in that way, how can you think of her life as anything other than exactly, like, could it have been anything different than what it is? And the episode seems to suggest, like, no, like it's she feels, I know you're a scholar of Greek tragedy, like this feels like very Sophoclean in that way to me. It's like you were destined for this. It could not have been any other way. And I think in that way, like, she really emerges as maybe the tragic figure of this episode, at least in those terms. I don't know, like I think you're far better equipped to talk about this than I am. So Yeah.
No, I think that's good. The other figure I would point to is actually her first role that we see her in as Lady Macbeth.
As Lady Macbeth,
right?
yeah.
I mean, because Lady Macbeth doesn't kill anybody.
I mean, not directly.
People are killed because she wants them dead, and she convinced Macbeth to do that.
Yeah.
But she also descends into madness.
She does, yeah.
Becomes increasingly volatile.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I think it's a troubling element that she ends up using violence along maybe similar lines to what he had done. Using violence, using the murder of other people to advance her own objectives.
And even like this idea, because
it's interesting though.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. But even the way Carillion Kodos wants to, like, that transition from Kodos to Carillion seems to suggest that it is, while complicated, easy to sever yourself from what you were. Like, it's a clean break, you know. Like, even the way Spock talks about, like, the last known reported sighting of Kodos corresponds with, like, the first known history of Carillion. Like, has not anyone noticed this before? You know, like, that's weird. You know.
Yeah.
But like, that seems to suggest that Kodos wants to imagine that there is a way to, like, cleanly sever yourself from what you were. But I think what his daughter, and in particular, like, her almost pathological fascination with ensuring that anyone who could identify you cannot, that seems to suggest that like, no, there are always consequences. Like, the past lingers in some way. It's constantly chasing you. And maybe the irony is, for a figure like Kodos, again, someone, as you said, who is so clear about wanting to shield his daughter from all of this, she emerges as the figure who like perpetually brings the past into the present. I think that's really fascinating as well.
All right. I think that's a good note to leave it on. So, again, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. This was great.
I really enjoyed it, and I don't think we necessarily talked about just the episode as a narrative. This is such a beautifully crafted narrative. Like, I cannot say I had any coherent thoughts about Star Trek, but I certainly watched, like, super cuts of, like, Shatner in the 60s, like, fighting a giant dragon monster. And I think, like, my impression, if I had any at all, was this is all just kind of silly, right? But I think, like, there's a degree of sophistication here that I'm sure people think about and talk about. But I was just supremely impressed by how interesting and nuanced and sophisticated this narrative is. So
yeah, I mean, some of the episodes are really, really amazingly crafted, and some of them are quite silly. Yes.
Do you know what I'll this is the last thing I'll say, what Kelsey Grammer, the actor who played Frasier Crane for like 9,000 years, what he always said about seasons of Frasier?
No.
So a conventional, well, like, before streaming and prestige television, most shows got like 21, 22 episodes a season, right? Kelsey Grammer talked about how there are 7 great episodes. There are 7 okay episodes. And then there are those other 7 episodes. And, like, I think about, like, Kirk fighting the dragon or whatever. It's like, that's one of those other episodes, you know?
Yep.
Yep. So, but thank you again, Phil.
Yeah.